Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to the 13th Annual Powell Lecture. My name is Zach Agee, and along with Joey Connor, I serve as co-chair of the Lewis Powell Jr. Distinguished Lecture Series. Tonight, we get to hear from Mr. David Westin. But just a brief note before, I would like to take a minute to recognize a few special guests that we have in the audience. First, I'd like to recognize Justice Powell's son, Mr. Lewis Powell III. Thank you for being here. And also, Justice's granddaughter, Hannah Powell. Hannah, thank you for being here as well. Tonight, we also have Judge G. Stephen Agee of Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Thank you for being here. Congressman Bob Goodlatte is with us tonight. He's class of 1977 at the law school. He's current chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and a past Powell Lecturer. Thank you, Congressman, for being here, and for bringing your district director, Debbie Garrett, and Christine Broughton, your district representative. Another law school alum is with us, and Judge Rebecca Connolly. Judge Connolly is the Chief Judge of the Bankruptcy Court for Western District of Virginia, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you. We'd also recognize Paul Stephen, Distinguished Professor at University of Virginia Law School, and a former Powell clerk and friend of David Westin. I also want to thank Dean Denleitner, Professor Helwig, and all faculty for coming tonight. And lastly, I want to thank the Powell Board for your diligent work in making today's events happen. In 2002, 5 students decided to make the Distinguished Lecture Series for Lewis Powell Jr. That series has been student-run ever since. Each year, the Powell Board invites one person to give a lecture annually. This year, we were lucky enough to have Mr. Westin accept that invitation. Each Powell lecturer in the past comes from a different background, a different profession. From Justice Scalia, to Congressman Goodlatte, to Judge Wilkinson, Judge Jeffrey Sutton, and Mr. Westin. Each individual, though, shares 2 traits. The first is an admiration for Justice Powell, and the second is an embodiment of the values that Justice Powell stood for: honor and service. So tonight, we have a special treat to hear from Justice Powell's son, Lewis Powell III, and introduce our speaker, Mr. Westin.
Thank you very much. Judge Agee, Judge Connolly, Congressman Goodlatte, Dean Denleitner, it's always a pleasure to come back to the campus of Washington Lee, where I spent many happy years, too many years ago to count. With Hannah here as a first year in the college, it gives me an excuse to come back more regularly. And I really enjoy being in Lexington any time of year, but April is especially fun, as you all know. And it's fun to be here with my good friend David. My wife Lisa and I sleep in a bed once slept in by my great-great-uncle Ned. You're wondering, no doubt, what that possibly has to do with the Powell Lecture and David Westin. My father also used to sleep in that bed. Dad, as some of you may know, before he went on the court and then once on the court, was an exceptionally strong and ardent defender of the First Amendment. Along the way, he counted as, among his good friends, a number of journalists. It was a small number, but they were nonetheless fine people and able journalists. One of them was Charlie McDowell, who was a syndicated columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch and was a regular participant on public radio and an exceptionally astute observer of the American scene. McDowell grew up in Lexington because his father was on the law faculty in the 20s and 30s. Another favorite of my father's was Nina Totenberg, and if any of you listen to NPR regularly, you will hear Nina talk about what's going on at the Supreme Court. Though not trained as a lawyer, she is an exceptionally astute consumer of what happens at the court, and I always loved listening to her. McDowell was a good friend of my father's, and he had these stories that he liked to weave, and I'll share one of them with you here today. and you'll understand why I started off talking about the bed that I sleep in. McDowell had a thesis that our country is incredibly young by any rational measure, and he would often use as exemplars of his theme Robert E. Lee and Lewis Powell. And he liked to say that we think that all these people are old and gone, and it was a long time ago, but Lee was born in 1807, just 18 years after the formation of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was president. A mere 100 years later, in 1907, Justice Powell was born. Although Lee died here in 1870, and my father wasn't born for another 37 years, there were two links between the two men that might be of interest. While he was here in the college, Dad spent a year or two living in a boarding house owned by a maiden lady named Miss Annie Jo White. And hanging in the foyer of Annie Jo White's house was a photograph of her as a child sitting in the lap of Robert E. Lee, who was sitting astride his warhorse Traveler. And so that's one connection between General Lee and my father and today. And the other was Uncle Ned, who was a first-year student at the University of Virginia in 1861 when hostilities broke out, and like everybody else, he left Charlottesville, joined the Army of Northern Virginia, was seriously wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg, but rejoined his unit and was there at Appomattox at the end, returned to his home in Hanover County, and spent the rest of his days running a very small school for boys. Uncle Ned was my father's only grandparent figure. My father's maternal and paternal grandparents died when he was very young, so he grew up in the thrall, really, of his Uncle Ned, in whose bed I now sleep. And Uncle Ned was apparently a much revered gentleman, taught this boys' school and had a big influence on my father, and I've often thought Uncle Ned's reverence for Robert E. Lee had something to do with my father's decision to attend school here. So dial forward now to April of 2015, and across the nation, and especially in the Commonwealth, we are commemorating the end of the Great Conflict, which ended 150 years ago this month. But if you stop and slice the timeline, when my father came to school here in 1925, it was only 60 years after the conclusion of hostilities. And so the Civil War was very much on his mind and very much a part of the culture of Virginia and this institution, particularly because of the influence of Robert E. Lee. Some of you may know, in the spring of 1865, as the war was winding down, Little Washington College, barely alive, graduated one student. So one young man got a diploma in 1865. When my father got here 60 years later, he joined a freshman class of some 350 young men. So Robert E. Lee laid the foundation in the few years he was president for where we are today. Interestingly enough, as some of you know, the law school, though founded in 1849 as the Lexington School of Law, did not become affiliated with the university until Lee was president. It was 1866, I believe, that the law school joined Washington and Lee, making this the sort of the foundation for the university that you attend and I had the pleasure of attending some years ago. So I see all these links, and it comes together with David, who clerked for my father his second year out of law school. So if you want to do the timeline again, you've got our speaker, David Westin, who clerked for Supreme Court Justice, who, when he was a student here, lived in a house owned by a lady who, when she was a child, sat in the lap of Robert E. Lee when he was riding trousers. So that's not very many connections, and it's a powerful reminder, I think, that Charlie McDowell was right all along, that our country is really very young. Now, if you were wondering what all this has to do with our speaker today, the answer, I suppose, is not very much. Nonetheless, my father was an avid student of history. And if he were here introducing David, I think his mind would naturally go to Charlie McDowell, and he would think about other journalists whom he held in high regard. And sooner or later, that might have led him to remember Charlie McDowell's stories, and it would have taken him to Uncle Ned and Annie Jo White and Robert E. Lee and Traveler, and of course, this incredible university to which he devoted a great deal of his time and energy over the years. David Westin is one of the most accomplished people I know. He's also one of the finest people I know, and I distinguish between those two because the two don't always run together. His CV sparkles with achievement. He was an honors graduate from the University of Michigan in 1974. He went straight to the law school, where he was summa cum laude. From there, he went to the Second Circuit, clerked for Judge Lombard, and then in 1978 and 79, he clerked for my father, and that's when I had the pleasure of joining David's ever-widening circle of friends. He left his clerkship and joined one of the leading law firms in the country, Wilmer Cutler Pickering, where Lloyd Cutler, then the dean of the law firm and one of the great lawyers in America, took David under his wing as his protege, and he rapidly rose through the ranks of the Wilmer Cutler firm, which is now the Wilmer Hale firm. Became a partner, spent 12 years there, and then came to a gigantic fork in the road that many lawyers, I think, would not have taken, being comfortable in the partnership of a really fine firm. He was offered the opportunity to become the general counsel of Capital Cities ABC, and he took it. He spent 3 years as general counsel, and then he took another fork in the road that I'm not even sure David could explain. They took him out of the lawyering side of the house, and they made him the head of the ABC television network. And he was head of production. And I will never forget when he was visiting with us, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said, "I really don't have any idea. I don't watch much television." So I thought, well, somebody's either a lot dumber than I am or a lot smarter than I am. It didn't seem to make any sense that David would be selecting primetime sitcoms and soap operas and the like. He did that for a few years, and then another fork in the road inside the Cap Cities ABC world, and this must be what was going on in some genius's mind. They made him the president of the ABC News Division. And that was in 1997, and he spent the next 13 years as an eyewitness and a participant, albeit behind the scenes, in some of the most amazing times of recent years. If you think about what happened during those 13 years, soon after he took over the post, you had the Clinton impeachment, then you had the contested presidential election of 2000, followed very quickly by 9/11, and the commencement of the war on terror and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, followed up very quickly by the Great Recession, the next big presidential election, the historic election of Barack Obama in 2008, and when all of this is going on, the gathering and delivery of news is undergoing a revolution of its own as we go deep into the digital age and the age of new media. And David was there at the helm of ABC News during all of this, presiding with great distinction in what were very tough years for the news business, particularly the television news business. He left there after 13 years and is now the president of a very interesting consulting firm called Witherby Holdings. He provides advice and counseling regarding media and new media and the digital world we live in and the intersection of all those elements. He is married to the lovely, talented, and vivacious Sherry Westin, whose mother is up here from Roanoke. We're very glad to have you now. They have 5 children, 3 grandchildren. I'm reliably advised that among David's most secret and guilty pleasures are pecan pie and single malt Scotch whiskey. He is an accomplished sailor. He's a fine tennis player. He's a voracious reader. He would much rather listen than talk. They live in Bronxville, New York, and among the surprising things I've learned in the last few days, is that David is fluent Russian speaker. Sherry said that they'd been married for several years and they were at a dinner party, and before she knew it, he was carrying on a conversation in some strange tongue next to the person seated on the opposite side, and she learned it was Russian and that David picked up Russian along the way. And Sherry, how was it that you didn't know this? And she said, he's just the most amazing man. There are these things that he does and knows and is capable of, and I don't yet know them all. So that's my friend David Westin.
Wow. So thank you all very much, first of all, for being here. I'm deeply honored. I'm honored by Judge Agee, although I understand you didn't have much choice. You're a relative here. And by Congressman Goodlatte. As I said last night when I pulled up my mother-in-law's house, there was a bumper sticker across the back of her vehicle. And I realized that she's one of your constituents and one of your big supporters. And Judge Conley, thank you very much for being here. I'm honored that you're here. Dean Denweiler, thank you for all your hospitality. You've been really wonderful. All your team has been. And welcome to the incoming Dean, July 1. We look forward to your tenure, Brent Hellwig. I also want to thank Paul Stephen, who was a law clerk. He was the star of the Chamber's the 78 term. He would deny that, but I can tell you I was there, and I know. And if the justice were here, he would say the same thing. But it's wonderful. He's on the faculty of UV. I didn't know you were a distinguished professor. That's what I just heard, but I'll take that. I'll take that as your word. But Paul's a wonderful friend and a wonderful law professor. And it does mean a great deal to me that my mother-in-law, Charlotte Sandy, made the trek all the way from the wilds of Roanoke up the road, brought by her good friend Don Huffman, who is a distinguished alum and oil lord of this institution as well. So thank you. And then there's Lewis. Let me tell you, I knew Lewis Powell long before I met him. And I knew him because just about from the first moment I spent any time with Justice Powell, I started hearing about his son, Lewis. And even discounting for a bragging father, it was pretty intimidating. I heard about this scholar that he was. I heard about the athlete he was and how he beat the tennis pro at the club. He was so good at tennis. I heard, and this is a true story, I'm not exaggerating, how they went on a safari to Africa, were charged by a lion. And Justice Powell didn't have the best eyesight in the whole world, I think it's fair to say. And Lewis picked up his rifle and shot this lion dead. And in case I doubted it, he had this lion skin rug in his in the apartment in Washington. And he would proudly say, see, there's the lion that Lewis shot. So this is what I knew about Lewis before I met him. And then I met Lewis, and I got to know him a bit. And to my great consternation, it turned out that Justice Powell, once again, was understating the case. If anything, Lewis was even more than he had been predicted to be by his father. And it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to have gotten to know Lewis. And I'm delighted that Hannah is here, whom I've known for a good long time now. I'm glad she's here, and it's a treat to have you here, Hannah. So let me start out with I think it's called Declaration Against Interest or Impeaching a Witness. A lot of you don't know me. I'm a reasonably balanced fellow. I usually see the good and the bad in most situations and most people. I can't do that here because I am an unabashed Powell enthusiast. I really adored this man. And so you should take into account anything I have to say. You should discount it just a little bit. And you said, Zach, that you were lucky that I accepted. I was lucky that you invited me. And Zach and Joey have been wonderful. And the whole board has been bringing me up here. One of the things I got from my year with Justice Powell was I got an entirely different way of looking at the world. And that may sound like an exaggeration, but it really is not. It really is not. And that happened principally because I wasn't a Yankee. I shared none of the heritage that Lewis laid out so eloquently. I can't trace my history back more than a generation or two. And it was not distinguished. It had nothing to do with pictures with Robert E. Lee or Traveler. So I was a Yankee in Justice Powell's chamber. Now, you might think that it was 13 years then after Appomattox. It's shocking it's now 150. That can't possibly be right. But you might think that wouldn't have mattered, but it did matter. And it mattered right from the beginning. The first opinion that I worked on with Justice Powell was in a Voting Rights Act case. And Justice Powell had a problem with Voting Rights Act cases. Don't misunderstand me. He was for everybody having the vote, having equal access to votes. But he had this idea that the southern states had been singled out to go hat in hand to the Justice Department of Washington to ask for any changes to be made in their election laws or regulations. And what he thought from his point of view was it was good enough for the people who had to surrender to Appomattox, it was good enough for everybody else. So why did they do it for everybody? So he pretty routinely dissented in these cases. And he had particular problems in this case. It was Dougherty County against White, which came out of Georgia. And he had a particular problem because it wasn't a voting law that was involved. It was an employment regulation of the local school board. And they'd adopted what sounds like a pretty reasonable regulation, saying if you're employed by the school board and you want to run for public office, you should take a leave of absence while you're campaigning. It was reasonable. Now, there was one catch. They adopted this regulation only after a black employee decided to run for school board. And so the Justice Department took exception to that. They thought that was not a good idea. So we had the case argued, went to conference. Justice Powell just said, he said he was going to write, and I was the clerk assigned by Paul, I'm sure, to the case because he was the administrative law clerk. So we sat down and I went over with Justice how we would like to have it written, what it would be. And I dutifully took ourselves up to that small office we had upstairs where we used to get serious work done to dig into this draft opinion for Justice Powell, the dissent. I really, as I recall, at least read through, at least skimmed through the entire voluminous history of the 1965 Voting Rights Act case. I read all of Justice Powell's opinions, and I painstakingly drafted an opinion that I thought that I could present to the justice, and he might find valuable. So I turned it in, and a few days later, Justice Powell said, well, I'd like to sit down and talk to you about this. And so I went into his office, and I sat down across from his desk, and he started out, and forgive me, remember I'm a Yankee, so I can't do this accent. But as I recall it, he said, David, you refer in your draft to the Civil War. And I looked at him perplexed, and I thought, yeah, I mean, when we went to Michigan, that's what you called it. It was called the Civil War. What's the issue? And you could see Justice Powell looking at me, and he figured out I was not getting this. So Justice Powell said, when I went to school, we did not refer to it as the Civil War. It was the war between the states. And so now I'm more than perplexed. I'm thinking, what conceivable difference can it make whether we call it the Civil War or the war between the states? And then my mind racing, I came up with a hypothesis. I said, oh, you mean the states that seceded. So you couldn't have a civil war. It had to be a war between the several states. And he smiled and he said, exactly. And then we proceeded to take apart the draft and redo it. Now, if you look back at Dougherty County against White, you will discover that there's no reference made to a war between 1861 and 1865, no matter what you call it, Civil War, war between states, or anything else. And in fact, in other opinions, Justice Powell did refer to the Civil War. So now, in looking back on this, I realized that he was having a bit of fun at the expense of a very green and very angry law. Now, in addition to having some fun, he was also starting a process of teaching me. He was teaching me on himself. First and foremost, he was teaching me about judging, and he was teaching me about life. First thing he was teaching me was that people can have very, very different viewpoints, even about the same events. This was something that I believe he drove home with us throughout our time with Justice Powell. He valued having different viewpoints in the chambers. He wanted us all to come from different points of view and to bring those into the chambers and to have discussions and debates and to particularly make sure that he was exposed to all issues and all sides of every issue so that he could consider them. It was a hallmark, I think, of Justice Powell's way of approaching decisions and perhaps life itself. The other thing he was doing is he was modeling a form of exquisite care he took whenever questions came up of our government and our government institutions and how they would work one with the other. Now, this certainly applied when there were conflicts within parts of the federal government. It applied when there were conflicts, as there are sometimes, between the federal government and the state government. But for Justice Powell, he went beyond that because he recognized a range of civic institutions that he found essential to what we did. And this includes charities and churches and school boards and clubs and, yes, even news organizations. And he took great care as a judge to make sure that the federal government, and particularly the federal courts, weren't doing anything that inadvertently undermined the strength of those civic institutions. His experience had taught him that these were the institutions that made it possible for all of us to shape our communities locally and also that help shape policy and even choose our leaders as a nation. This was a terribly important priority for Justice Powell. When most of us think about Justice Powell, we think about him as a Supreme Court justice, which he was, as we know, for a little over 15 years. At some point about the midpoint of his tenure, sometime after I left the chambers, there was a story that circulated around in Washington that a group of lawyers from the Solicitor General's office, who regularly appeared before the Supreme Court, were talking one day and were asking themselves the hypothetical: if they had only one justice to have decide an important case, which justice would they pick? And the story was that they all said to me that it would be Justice Powell. So we can ask ourselves, why is it that these people who in some ways knew the 9 justices best had such faith in Lewis Powell? Well, you can start with the fact that he was a careful and disciplined lawyer. As you know, he spent a career in the Richmond Bar, as a leader of the Richmond Bar, starting with litigation but then moving on to represent some of the most important clients and some of the most difficult matters, both in the courtroom and in the boardroom. He rose to run his law firm of Hunt and Williams, Gay, Powell, and Gibson, as it was then called, and built it really into the national and international powerhouse that it is today. I certainly saw the extreme care he took with every case that came before him in personally going over all of the arguments and reading all the briefs and reading the amicus and listening to the advocates and listening to fellow justices. He had a very deep reverence for and respect for the discipline of the law. He took that legal craftsmanship and built on that foundation by bringing 2 things to his judging that others didn't bring and maybe haven't to this day. He had a rich life experience, even outside of law practice, and he brought that experience to bear in his judging that took his judgments that could be considered as fair and made them wise. From the beginning, he looked outside of the 4 corners of Hunt and Williams and even of Richmond for this life experience. In the early 1950s, he was on a commission that redid how Richmond government worked. And then he accepted appointment to the school board and quickly rose to become chair of the school board. As I think all of us know, he had a leadership position in the ABA, ultimately moving up to be president of the ABA, and took on major issues such as legal responsibility and legal services to the poor, and made a real difference as head of the ABA. He also was an early lawyer advising on colonial Williamsburg, and ended up helping build that and really lead it forward. And then he served on 2 commissions, one for President Johnson in the mid-1960s on law enforcement, and then later in the late 1960s for President Nixon on the military. So Justice Powell had a rich and varied life experience before he ever got to the court. Now, for some people, this rich life experience might be a way of building a formidable resume. But Powell was storing up experiences to draw upon once he was called upon to address some of the important issues of our day. 2 examples come to mind from my time with Justice Powell, one of which has been talked about in other circles, but I found out first at a lunch that Paul and I and the other law clerks attended with Justice Powell in September of 1978. Justice Powell had just come back from the summer he spent in Richmond, and he had what I recall as sort of a get-acquainted lunch with his 4 law clerks, where we talked about how we were going to work together and what he expected of us. And in the course of this lunch, he volunteered, for reasons I don't recall, he volunteered why he had voted the way he had in Roe against Wade, which had been about 5 years earlier. And as Justice Powell recounted the story, he'd been sitting in his law office in Richmond one day, and Sally Smith, his longtime assistant, had buzzed in to say, "We have a young messenger here who needs to see you urgently." And Powell said, "Well, why does he need to see me?" And she said, "Because there's a warrant out for his arrest." So Powell said, "Please send him in right away." So this young African-American man, who was still a teenager, told the story of how he had a teenage girlfriend, also African-American, and she'd gotten pregnant. Now, at this point in the Commonwealth of Virginia, abortion was illegal. And this young couple didn't have conceivably the means to go to one of the states where abortion was legal at that point. And so they'd gone to an illegal place to have an abortion done at cut rate, and it had been botched, and she'd hemorrhaged, and she died. And the police, in looking into the reasons for the death, discovered the story. and they went after this young man to charge him with her death. And Justice Powell, as I recall it, said, I don't want to live in a country where that young man and that young woman have to go to a back alley butcher. Now, let's be clear, with all Supreme Court decisions, there's more to it than that. I mean, as I recall, Roe against Wade had been argued before, there had been a tentative vote taken before. There was not, I don't believe, anybody on the court at the time who saw abortion as being the major moral issue that some people do today. So I'm not saying that was the only thing that affected him. But it is an example, I think, of how his real life experience, even running a major law firm in Richmond, allowed him to take experiences and bring them to bear in situations that normally you'd think Lewis Powell would know nothing about this situation whatsoever, would have nothing to contribute to it. A second example hasn't been told before, I don't believe. One of the cases I worked on with Justice Powell was Raucus against Illinois, in which a car had been stopped late one night by some police because it matched the description of a car used in an armed robbery. And the police did a search of the car without a warrant and found a sawed-off rifle under the driver's seat. And they found some rifle shells in the locked glove compartment. So when the occupants were charged with armed robbery, they sought to suppress the evidence, saying you violated our Fourth Amendment rights in doing this search. Justice Powell voted with majority not to suppress the evidence. But he decided to write separately a concurring opinion because in his view there should be an overall reasonableness test applied, and in this case this was not unreasonable. But as we were working, the two of us, on the opinion, he started talking about the experience of police patrolling urban streets late at night. And I said, well, Justice Powell, how can you know so much about this? He said, well, when I was chair of the Richmond School Board, I decided that I needed to understand better the situation of Richmond police. So I spent several nights in the back of a police cruiser going around the streets of Richmond to understand what they were facing. So this is the sort of example of the sort of rich life experience he had, but he also had an ability to apply. Most important from what I saw, more important even than his legal craftsmanship or his ability to draw upon life experiences, the thing that made Justice Powell a really fine judge, a great judge in my view, was the fact that he would try his best to suspend his final decision and his judgment until as far in the process as possible. He insisted on going through the entire process and trying to hear all sides of it before he made a final decision. Today, when someone is nominated to the Supreme Court, it seems like it is almost all about ideology and politics. There's an assumption, it seems like, on the part of the media, yes, the media, and the politicians, that these people who are nominated have already decided all these cases in their head. Cases that have never been argued, never been presented, but they know how they're going to vote. And so the selection process and the confirmation process seems to be sometimes a matter of ferreting out these secret decisions they've already made. This was not Powell's approach. Justice Powell felt passionately that he needed to read it all, listen to it all, hear the debate among his justices, and including his law clerks, and really wait till the process was completed in order to make his final judgment. An example of this, it goes beyond just having a Yankee who didn't know the difference between the Civil War and the war between the states. An example of this for me was one opinion we were working on where Justice Powell had voted with the majority, but he was not writing. And another chamber circulated around a draft majority opinion. And I read it, and I thought that there were some issues with his majority opinion, so I quickly batted out a 5-page memo. And went to Justice Powell's chambers with it. And as I'm walking in the door, he looks up and he says, David, I sent a join note. Now, for those of you who don't know, a join note is a little piece of paper that says I join and had initials. And that was the official record of who was joining these opinions. And so I said, oh, okay, that's fine. Just while I wrote this memo, you didn't read it anymore because you've already joined. Well, Justice Powell would have none of that. Here is a Supreme Court justice with a lot of his platter. He said, no, I need to read your memo. And he sat down and carefully read the memo, holding out the possibility he might change his vote, even at that late stage, or at the very least suggest changes in what the majority opinion had said. Lewis Powell's time in the Supreme Court would, in and of itself, have been more than enough for his place in history. But there was a broader role that Powell played on the national scene, one that started before he ever got to the court and continued to the day that he left us. And one that I suspect he might have thought was more important even than his own Supreme Court. Justice Powell was a citizen of this country. He loved the United States of America deeply. He loved it in its perfect aspirations, and he loved it in its less than perfect attempts to realize those aspirations. For Powell, being a citizen was more than just a passive status. It was an active role that required all of us to do all that we possibly can for our nation. I think a prime example of this was his service during World War II. When World War II happened, Justice Powell was 34 years old and had a wife and 2 young daughters in Richmond. He was not eligible for the draft. So he went and volunteered. The first time he volunteered, he was rebuffed. The Navy said, your eyesight isn't good enough. You can't volunteer. So he kept at it and went to the Army Air Forces, which took him in and commissioned him a second lieutenant, put him in intelligence and assigned him to a bombing group that was sent over to England. When the Allied forces went into North Africa in November of 1942, Powell's bombing group was there, and he planned many of the bombing raids. There were very extensive casualties and losses of his group, which weighed very heavily on him. After the Allied forces prevailed in North Africa, Powell in 1944 was assigned to the Ultra Project at Bletchley Park outside of London. This is the Bletchley Park that's featured in the Imitation Game movie that we just all saw about the breaking of the German codes. Part of an elite group of American officers who were there for liaison. By the end of the war, Justice Powell was a colonel. He had a Bronze Star. He had a Legion of Honor. And I remember that he was, I think, never quite so proud and pleased as when a piece of mail would come into the chambers that would be addressed not to Justice Powell, but to Colonel Powell. He was part of the greatest generation. He was part of the group of people who saved the United States and the Western world from the tyranny of fascism. He never bragged about it, but it was clearly extremely important to him. When his country needed him most, he left behind his family and his law practice in Richmond and stepped up and made the sacrifice. Now, speaking here today, I can't presume to talk for Justice Powell, a citizen, about how he would feel about where we are in this country. But what I can do is try to apply some of the lessons I believe I learned from him to where we are. I must say, I think that in some ways we have a lot of work to do and that we're not realizing the ideal that Justice Powell pursued all of his life. Our democracy is not working today the way I think any of us would hope it would work. Last fall we had a national election where we elected all of our House of Representatives and a third of our senators. In that national election, only 37% of eligible voters actually turned up to vote. So what that means, if you think about it, is 2/3 of us as a country said we're going to delegate to 1/3 of the country the ability to choose our leadership and decide where we're headed. Now, if the 1/3 broadly represented what we all thought, that would be an unfortunate failure to act as citizens, but it would be no worse than that. The problem is, I believe that there's very good reason to believe that the 1/3 don't represent the other 2/3 at all. We are today a highly polarized country. There are lots of indications of that. But let me give you one, I think, quite striking fact. If you go back to 1994, 20 years ago, and you look at the active Democrats and the active Republicans, the people who really turn out to vote, volunteer, contribute, you would find that 2/3 of the active Democrats were to the left of the average Republican. But that means that 1/3 of the active Democrats were actually to the right of the average Republican. Conversely, roughly 2/3 of the active Republicans were to the right of the average Democrat, but 1/3 of the active Republicans were actually to the left of the average Democrat. If you do the same analysis today, 98% of each party is to the left or the right. Is the active participating group or the left or the right of the other. So the country has changed in many, many ways. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. Certainly, our reliance on primaries, I think, is one. Redistricting, you hear a lot of reasons for this. And I suspect that some of the civic institutions that Justice Powell cared so much about have been undermined to some extent, that we're not spending as much time with other citizens, exchanging views and coming to terms and arguing with one another, and that's part of the cause. But what causes me particular pain today is to know that one of the significant factors of this is the media that I've spent the last 25 years. When I went to Capital Cities ABC in 1991, broadcast television already had lost a lot of its dominance of television. Cable was on the scene, but at the same time, it was very influential. In 1994, again, taking that point, 1994, on a given night, an average of 40 million Americans watched one of the evening news broadcasts. 40 million Americans. That same year in 1994, 50% of all Americans regularly read newspapers. Right? Now take it forward to today, that 40 million people watching an evening newscast has gone to 24 million. And the 50% of people who regularly read newspapers is down to 25%. So the question is, if those people are not turning to those sources to get their general news, where are they going? Well, cable news, you might think, is actually a very small piece of the puzzle. On a given evening, an average of 3 million Americans watch all the cable news channels put together. So they haven't all gone over to cable news. And let's be honest, as we've watched, there's been increasing partisanship within cable news as well. Interestingly, it seems like the people who go to cable news, particularly the MSNBCs of this world and the Fox News, they're going because their minds are made up and they want to be reinforced as a practical matter. Nor is the internet and digital an answer to this, because even the most popular news sites and digital are still only a fraction of what the broadcasts are today, even after all the reductions in broadcast. And as we know, some of the really popular news sites online are themselves very polarizing. Glenn Beck has done a fabulous job as a business matter by taking his well-defined, super well-defined audience on Fox News and moving it over to a subscription service of people who really align with him and believe in him and believe in his point of view. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a very specifically defined part of the audience. So, it appears that we have millions of our fellow citizens who are no longer getting access to regular, general-purpose, nonpartisan news as a practical matter. Political scientists have been doing some studying of this and how that affects our political process. And they came up with something that's interesting, but once you hear it, it makes perfect sense to me. In a day when we had fewer choices in the media, there were many of us who sat still for the evening news because there was nothing else on. It was just that simple. And so we would watch the evening news and get exposure to that. That is no longer the case. There are so many alternatives for people who don't particularly want to seek out the news. And the reason why that's important is because there's a political profile to that group of people. They're not just like everybody else. These are the people that, when they vote, tend to go back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. These are the people who tend not to have their mind made up already. But now that they have so many alternatives, whether it's sitcoms or dramas or entertainment or cat videos, they've got a lot of other things to do with their time. And surprise, surprise, come election day, they've spent all their time doing something else. They're not that interested in voting, and they stay home. The flip side is also true. There is a group of people, it tends to be smaller than the group of people who would rather do something else than the news, but there's a group of people who will watch the news no matter what. They love the news. They can't get enough of it. And perhaps not surprisingly, that group tends to be the most polarized. They have made up their minds, and they want to go and be reinforced. And the problem is that because they have now 24 hours a day on their televisions and on their tablets and their smartphones and on their radio, they can get a steady diet of the news they really like. They are even more energized to work for their particular point of view and for their candidates. And these are the people who are contributing and volunteering, and they're certainly voting. And so come election day, they're the ones that are turning up. So what's to be done about this? I know something about television news, and we're not going back to a world where there are 3 national networks providing all our news. That's not going to happen. By the way, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. There's a richness that's provided to all of us of information and points of view with the digital world that none of us, least of all Justice Powell, would ever want to forego. So that's not a reasonable option. So the question, if we're not going to do that, what can we do? Well, one thing I can say for sure is that Justice Powell cared deeply, as Lewis talked about, really, cared deeply about the role of the press in our democracy. Lewis tells the story that when he started here at Washington Lee, his dad said to him, I have some advice for you. I think you should make a habit of reading at least a couple of newspapers every day and watching an evening news broadcast and reading the op-ed page, as Lewis says in Justice Powell's words, I guess, and make sure you read both sides. Justice Powell, and I, from my personal experience, I worked on an opinion with him where it was a First Amendment case, Sixth Amendment case, where a reporter wanted access to a closed pretrial proceeding and was excluded and brought a challenge to it. And in working with him on the case, Justice Powell volunteered that he could never be a journalist because it was somewhat distasteful, frankly, because you had to pry into people's personal lives and find out secrets that they didn't want you to know about, things like that. But, he said, David, I think a vigorous press is essential to a democracy. So Justice Powell valued the press greatly. And I'm sad to say that I'm not sure that we have the press today that Justice Powell envisioned for our democracy. In large part because of all the competition from other non-news sources, but even more from other news sources, but even from non-news sources. Because of that, some of our major news organizations have cut back on their reporting. And they're spending more and more time covering scandals and celebrities and human interest stories. Now, there is nothing wrong with any of the stories, but where they become part of the problem is when they start displacing some other reporting that could give us a more engaged and informed electorate than we have right now. We also have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves what's going on. The one truth I can bring to you today from the world of television media is we all get the news media that we deserve. It's up to us in part. If we spend our time and attention seeking out the substantive reporting and pay attention to it, we'll get more of it. And the flip side is also true. If we spend a lot of time on non-substantive issues, the media will respond to that. They will give us more of it. So we have to bear some of the responsibility ourselves. But Justice Powell, as much as he cared about the press and the news media, would be, I think, the first to say there are a lot of other civic institutions we need to take a hard look at in order to address this issue. We need to do whatever we can to invite back in the people who have dropped out of political participation. That center that is distracted with other things. And surely there must be ways that we can use digital and other means, but digital is a wonderful, powerful tool to make more people vote and make more people be informed. There must be ways we can use digital for that. I think we also need to do whatever we can to encourage all of us to suspend judgment as long as we can in the process, so we don't come to every question having decided the answer before we even hear what the question is. Again, I think there must be ways to use digital so that even if you go to a website or an app with a particular point of view, you have ready access to a range of points of view, not just one. I think, above all, Justice Powell would want us to learn that lesson he tried to teach a young Yankee lawyer, which is that we can have very different points of view about the same events, the same issues, the same policies. But it's critically important that we do, as I saw Justice Powell do, that we really value those different viewpoints. And we value them by paying attention to them, by listening to them, by considering them carefully, so that we can together, as a community, as a nation, start to address the important issues in front of us. Now, in conclusion, I am very aware that all of this sounds very idealistic, even unrealistic. But the Justice Powell I knew was both grounded in the reality of what we are and also reached for the ideal of what we all together could become. We can pay no greater honor to Justice Powell today than by trying our best to follow his great example. Thank you very much.
Now we have time for a few questions. We're just going to open it up to the floor. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask, obviously a very interesting lecture that covered on a bunch of different topics. I'm sure we have some questions in the audience. Please.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you, sir, for coming. I recall after the 2012 election that David Frum, of course, the conservative columnist, made the comment on a news show that conservative voters had been, I believe the phrase was, fleeced, lied to, and exploited by what he termed the conservative entertainment complex. And I would argue that there is something comparable on the left as well, that these folks are businessmen and businesswomen and very effective at it. I'm wondering, from a business perspective, how you could foresee a more moderate, not necessarily centrist, but more, I guess, a business model for a media industry that is defined by commonalities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I didn't remember what Trump said. Let me say two things. And maybe I'll think of a third. But one thing is, you're right that money matters in media in this country. And there's a tendency, by the way, I think it also matters in politics, but I don't know politics as well as media. But there's a tendency in this country to really focus on the ideology. And let me give you an example with Fox News. There's a tendency to think, oh, Fox News, they're conservative. You know, and they are right of center. They'll agree they're right of center, not radically right of center. MSNBC's left of center. But the thing that people tend to miss is what a great business model it is. Roger Ailes was a genius, a business genius, because he identified an underserved part of the population and felt that they were excluded from the mainstream news. He went for that rigorously with a very defined brand. And the most important thing he did is he figured out that when you move from broadcast to cable, broadcast is supported only by advertising, where you need to get as many people as possible. And so you didn't want to offend anybody or take a position on anything. When you move to cable and you get subscription dollars, you could actually make more money having a smaller audience that's more dedicated to you. Because when you negotiate your deal with the cable company, the thing a cable company can't afford is to lose any of their subscribers. So you can really raise the rates. And as a result, Fox News is by far the most profitable news organization in the country. I think it's the most profitable in the world. So you're right that there is a substantial business component of this. Now, the second, and I don't mean to be flip about this, but in a sense you're sort of asking the CNN question. You figured out the right and the left, and how you gave money there. You know, how can you know, it's like Goldilocks. You know, you get it just right in the middle. And nobody, I don't think anyone has really successfully done that yet. My personal view, this is really only a personal view, is I think there should be a way to be in the center and take shots at both sides. Because I think there's a lot being said that's wrong on both the extremes, particularly as you go out to the extremes. There are things that are factually wrong. There are things that you really can make powerful points about. And my personal view is if you did try to be in the center and really go after both sides, say, wait a second, that can't be right. Wait a second, that can't be right. I would like to believe that you could generate enough passion and enough engagement to have a meaningful business plan. But it's not been done yet, so I don't know if it's right. Other question? Yes.
Actually, going conversely off that, have you heard of Vice News?
Sure.
So I just wanted your general opinion of that, because it seems to be going in a direction different than, say, the larger companies, and their business models are a little different.
Does everyone know Vice News? How many people in here know Vice News? So maybe half, something like that. Vice News came out of actually a free magazine, as I call it, out of Toronto. And it is, and I mean this with great respect, it's sort of gonzo journalism. They've got a video service now. They've just announced a weekly program on HBO. They have it a daily program. They have it a weekly program. And what they do is it appeals to young men. And it's a very specific and targeted demographic. They have done some outstanding reporting. In Ukraine, they have a fellow who's a native Russian speaker who's, by the way, I'm not a fluencer. My wife is way It's a good story. I took some Russian and I could talk it once, but my wife tells that story. And what she doesn't tell is that, what she didn't tell you maybe is, she said to me at the end of dinner, how could you not tell me you're fluent Russian speaker? I said, you never asked. It never came up. I mean, and they've done some really good, particularly in Eastern Europe, reporting. They're willing to take chances other people aren't. But they have, and this is maybe an alternative to the answer before, they've got a narrowly defined audience who really cares about them, who really feels, you know, they're their channel, and they are reputed to be pretty profitable. There's a lot of dispute about exactly how the money flows there, but there's a guy named Shane Smith who's really made a big splash there. It's interesting. Yes, sir.
How much do you see the kind of comedy revolution in news with the Jon Stewarts and the John Olivers and Colberts? How much do you see that negatively impacting traditional news outlets and affecting how people tend to consume news, whether it be objectively or now almost cynically?
Well, first of all, I think, particularly when it's Jon Stewart, who is clearly left of center, although he will take shots at the left as well, but he's clearly left of center. The thing that makes Jon Stewart work, I think, is actually there's an underlying truth to a lot of what he does. When he goes back and finds the old clips and shows how people contradict themselves, it's pretty powerful stuff. Nobody has quite been as effective from right of center yet in doing that. But I think the thing that makes it funny and compelling to some extent is there's some underlying truth. I think that the challenge for mainstream, or lamestream, the way some people call it, but mainstream news media is not the Jon Stewart. I think it's much more what some of the large organizations are doing to themselves. Now, I'm an old school guy on this. When I was at ABC News, I held the line. We would not let our anchors, we would not let Peter Jennings go on and act as Peter Jennings in a movie or a drama. Because I said, people think we're making it up anyway. Why are we going to confirm that? And there were instances when I was at ABC where I held a line and was very unpopular for it, and then it turned out to be the right thing because what got done was not reflecting the truth, and you lose control of it. I know Brian Williams. I like him personally. I feel terrible for him. But everything that happens like that does far more damage to established news organizations than what Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert and everybody else is doing. And when Dan Rather had his incident with the National Guard report, if you recall, I remember talking to my counterpart at CBS News about it and said, you have to understand, I am rooting for you to be right. Because if you're wrong, they're not going to say, oh, CBS does that and ABC doesn't. They're just going to say, they're all like that. And unfortunately, that's what happened. So I think what some of the mainstream large news organizations are doing to themselves is much more dangerous than anything that a comedian's going to do.
Well, let's have one more question.
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about sort of the social media element. So it used to be that when you sat down to watch the evening news, you were passively listening and watching evening news. And now, while you're watching the news or being part of any sort of media broadcast, you can tweet about it and chat about it. And so what do you think about this idea that the public is now sort of wanting to be part of the news making or news discussing process rather than passively receiving it? And might that be a reason why they may not be tuning into as many of the sort of passive listening news broadcasts?
Well, sure, particularly if you look at millennials,
right,
rather than maybe some old folks like me, although even I go on social media and pay attention. First of all, one of the major transformations, and Lewis referred to how much change there is going on in news today, and it is really stunning, and it's going to keep going. But one of the big changes is everybody's a news gatherer now. Anybody with a smartphone can take video from anywhere around the world and put it up and post it on the internet, and you get access to it immediately. So, and that's a great opportunity in the sense that you don't have to send a crew half around the world and pay a lot of money and take a lot of time. It's also a risk because there can be things up there that purport to be something that they're not. And sorting that out and figure out what's right. That said, this horse is out of the barn. We're not going to put this back together again. And what that means is we are seeing a continuing explosion in the number of news sources, from well-established, well-vetted, all the way down to what we call man on the street. Because left over, we don't call women on the street; they're called MOSs. But a wide range. One consequence of that is, in the olden days, there were sort of a handful of editors at national newspapers and at broadcast networks and things who every day sat down and said, okay, what are the important stories? And what's ready to go and what's not ready to go? What's true and what's false? And most of us sort of relied upon that. And said, okay, that's the way we're going to get our news. We understand it. Those days are gone. As a practical matter, each of us has to be our own editor now. We have to make our own decisions about what's important, what's not important, what's truthful, what's not truthful, because we're going to get a lot of conflicting information, which puts a lot of responsibility on the individual news consumer. Now, social media can help with some of that, because there's a certain amount of crowdsourcing. I mean, go back to the Dan Rather story, which is pretty old now. When that first started to unravel, which was right after the report, it was a blogger that I'd never heard of. I had no idea who they were. And then you could watch on the internet as other people weighed in and teased this thing out, and the story got shakier and shakier. So there's a certain crowdsourcing that can go on that if you rely upon, it takes more work, but you can sort of figure it out. And also, increasingly, it's your friends and what they're recommending to you. I mean, it's a little reported fact that Facebook is really driving news much more than just about anybody else right now. The amount of traffic on the internet that's news-related that comes off of Facebook and referrals among news is way more than Twitter or than Instagram's growing, but than Instagram, than Snapchat, any of those things. So whether right or wrong doesn't matter. It is. We are relying increasingly on our friends to make reference to it. Say, this is interesting. This is something I believe in. This is worthwhile. And I don't see that phenomenon stopping at all. But the most important thing, and this is what, again, I think we just have to realize it's a challenge, and it can be good and it can be bad, and to some extent it's what we make out of it. But it is a personal responsibility for each of us now that we didn't have to the same degree before to really be our own editor of the news. Thank you. Okay? Thank you.